making your way back to your seat, I'm going to invite you to turn with me to Daniel chapter 8. And as we look at Daniel 8, we're going to do so with this understanding that God leads us into the future of His making. Now, when we think about the future, we might be tempted to be anxious, to worry, to see the negative way that society or humanity is headed. We might be drawn to the doom and gloom type of predictions about the future. And we could point to lots of evidences to support that outcome that we might be hearing or thinking about or dreaming about. And feel anxious, feel worried. And some of that is included in Daniel chapter 8. But we want to be reminded, the way Daniel was reminded, that from God's perspective, God is leading us into the future of His making. God is the one in control of the future and of shaping that future and of taking us there. So God sees from a different vantage point than we do. So we're going to walk through that chapter, Daniel 8. But first we're going to read the whole chapter together. I'll read it out loud. You follow along in your copy of God's Word or on the screen. And once again, this is a vision that Daniel has. And as we read, if you're trying to get some clarity about how this vision matches with the previous two visions that we've seen. We saw a vision given to King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2. And then last week in Daniel 7, Daniel had the vision of the four beasts. And here we are with a third vision. Well, this vision is zooming in on a portion of the other two visions. Remember, the other two visions were clearly describing four kingdoms and then some end times furthering of what was going to happen on earth. Well, this vision zooms in on the middle of those other two visions. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that. So this isn't an alternate, this isn't something opposed to or different than the first two visions. This is zooming in on a portion of those two prophecies. All right, I'll read it out loud. You follow Daniel chapter 8. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had two horns. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him. And there was no one who could rescue from his power. As he did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And the host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground. And it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai. And it called, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end." And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Will you pray with me? God, we recognize that you see from a perspective high above ours. And that even as you are giving glimpses of how you have worked in the past, working in the present, will work in the future, God, we trust you. We ask that you instruct us, that you help us approach your word with reverence and awe, and at the same time, Lord, that you would put our feet on a path of faithfulness and obedience. Whatever you have in store for the future, we trust in your hand. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, if we look just at the end of that, chapter 8, Daniel said that he was overcome by the prophecy and the vision. And I think as we read through that, and as we reflect on the other prophecies we've already seen, we too might feel a little bit overwhelmed and overcome by the prophecy. Hopefully, though, We can understand it enough to see God's hand in all of it. And so we've already said that God is leading us into the future of His making. And as we look at the specific vision that Daniel has, we can see that God directs the future in specific detail. So God directs the future in specific detail. And this is an important point to make. You see, as we're looking at prophecies like this, there is a difference between predicting the future and directing the future. We can't understand prophecy as just God is showing in His foreknowledge what will happen. That is true. But God is also showing that He is the one directing what will happen. That's a very important distinction for us. Do we believe that God is sovereign over the ways of mankind? And that God is bringing about His purposes? Otherwise, God is just a helpless watcher, watching what's happening, and able to see where it's going, but not able to direct. That is not the God of the Bible. So we want to make sure that we're understanding as we approach prophecies, we're seeing that God is directing the future. And what chapter 8 helps us do, as we're zooming in on those other visions, we're seeing some very specific detail. And I alluded to this last week. But Daniel chapter 8 is a famous chapter. Now you might be thinking, well, it doesn't compare to Daniel in the lion's den, or the fiery furnace, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or even the writing on the wall, the handwriting on the wall. Those seem like more famous chapters. Well, Daniel chapter 8 is famous for another reason. Daniel chapter 8 is so specific in the details about how God is directing the future that it is one of the main parts of Daniel that people point to claim Daniel could not have been prophecy, but had to have been written after the fact. After these events happened. Because God gets into such specific detail. Naming the the kings of Media and Persia. Naming the king of Greece to come, and then the 4 kings after him. Those are so specific. And remember, this is several years before the Median Persian Empire rose to power and conquered Babylon. This is still in Babylon when this vision came. And so people look at that specific detail and they say, how could Daniel have known this? It must have been written hundreds of years later than this claim. But we know how. Because God directs the future. And not just in generalities. God directs the future in specific detail. I think as we're approaching Thanksgiving this week, this is a point at which we are to be thankful that God is directing the future. Because we can look at governments, we can look at people fighting about how nations should be run. We can look at governments trying to suppress their people. We can look at horrific crimes enacted around the world. And we can say, is God at work? And then we have this reminder from the Bible. Yes, God is at work. And even when times are difficult and dark, God is still directing the future in specific detail. And so, what are those details? Well, we saw the vision, and you can see an artist's depiction here that Daniel was standing there on the Ulai Canal, and he sees there a ram, so a male sheep, with 2 horns. And it is a powerful ram. And I don't know if you've ever been around sheep and rams, but they fight. I mean, we have the famous the Dall sheep, right? And those male sheep, they fight and they butt heads, and we hear reports every now and then of the sheep chasing after hikers and things. They have this drive to fight. And so it's this image of a powerful ram, and it's got these two long, very strong horns. And then as this ram is conquering its territory, Daniel said no one could stand against this ram. It's conquering its territory. Well, this ram is representative of the Babylonian Empire. Excuse me, the Grecian Empire. No. Medo-Persian. We have so many empires going on here. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. And remember, we've already seen in the other visions about the Medo-Persian Empire. And so it's got the two horns. And Daniel said in the vision, one horn was higher than the other. They were both high. Daniel said they were both big and strong and stout horns, but one was higher than the other. We've already said that. The Persian side of that empire was a stronger side, so it had more power than the Medo side. And so then, as this ram is unable to be conquered, here comes the Grecian Empire. It's in the form of a goat. Both the ram and the goat were used as symbols for those respective empires, according to studies in archaeology. But here comes this goat. And it's interesting about this goat. The goat is enraged, and as it comes, it is not touching the ground. It is coming with such speed that it is flying. And that, again, and we've already seen this in the prophecies, it was reminding us of the speed at which Alexander the Great and his Grecian Empire were able to conquer that portion of the world. And came and with this one great horn between his eyes, representing the Alexander the Great, the king. And it strikes the ram, breaks its horns, knocks it down, and destroys it. And this represents what was just around the corner for the Persian Empire, was then that here comes Greece and taking over. And so as we have this goat with the horn, and it is strong and it is powerful, and no one can stand against it. No, it is going north and south and east and west. No beast, it says, can stand against it. And then the horn is broken off. This represents Alexander the Great dying. He died young while the empire was still intact. And so 4 horns spring up, facing the 4 winds. And this represents the division of the Grecian Empire under the 4 generals that became kings of the various portions of the Grecian Empire. And so this is the very specific detail that we see Daniel getting a glimpse of, and people saying, how can this be that God would reveal this? And we know that it is because God is directing the future in very specific detail. But then there is the matter of what happens after these 4 horns come up. And this is where the detail from especially Daniel's perspective, and then since then, it's been harder to see. But we have a hint, a pretty good understanding of what is meant when this small horn comes up and grows up and has this. This is represents a bold-faced king. And so, what I want to do now is to think about this next part of the prophecy. What happens with this bold-faced king? And I believe this is the part that gave Daniel such trepidation about the prophecy. See, Daniel has seen visions about nations rising and falling. Daniel has lived under multiple kings by this point. And so one nation fighting against another probably is not that big of a deal to Daniel. But he sees something in this vision that is so oppressive to him that he lays sick in bed for days. And I believe it's this next part. And what Daniel saw is what we need to recognize too, and that is that the path toward fulfillment of God's redemptive purpose sometimes leads through suffering. The path toward fulfillment of God's redemptive purpose sometimes leads through suffering. And I would say that sometimes is being generous. Maybe we should say many times or often leads through suffering. See, what Daniel saw in this vision, and what the overwhelming majority of interpreters and biblical scholars agree that Daniel saw, was a foretelling of great suffering for the Jewish people. Now you might say, wait a minute, they were already in exile. They had been suffering for several generations. First the kingdom of Israel falling, then the kingdom of Judah falling, and all these displaced people in exile, and the people that were still living in the territory suffering at the hands of marauders and having their villages destroyed and their cities destroyed. How could they suffer more? Well, what Daniel saw was that there was a long road ahead for God's people, but that it was bringing about God's redemptive purpose. You can see this sculpted bust here. This is a depiction of the Greek king Antiochus IV. And most, as I mentioned, most scholars agree that this little horn that represents a bold-faced king was fulfilled at least partially by Antiochus IV. I want to tell you a little bit about Antiochus the Fourth before we talk about why might God have done this. So we saw some interesting things in the prophecy about this small horn that grew up and represented a bold-faced king, and that he was infatuated with his own power, and that he was given power to bring destruction, to destroy mighty men, and to destroy the saints. This is verse 24. That by his cunning he's going to make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he's going to become great, and without warning he will destroy many. Then it says, he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. And they talked also about the temple, briefly mentioning that he was going to, the sanctuary was going to be given over to him and trampled underfoot. And there's more about this specific part of the vision in Daniel 11 and 12. But let's talk about how Antiochus IV might have been the fulfillment of this. So this is, if we're following this progression, it's after the Medo-Persian Empire falls to the Grecian Empire, and Alexander the Great, and then the four kings come after Alexander the Great dies, and they divide up the Grecian Empire. And then after those kings are in place for a while, there are power struggles, there are successions, and about 175 years before Jesus was born, Antiochus IV comes to power. And he rules over the portion of the Grecian Empire that is the Middle East, like Syria and down, closing in on Egypt. And in fact, he wages war, tries to wage war and conquer Egypt, but then fails. The Romans step in, and he's sent back. During his predecessor's reign, they had a very benevolent rule over their peoples. They did not force their peoples, because remember, this Grecian Empire covered many peoples of different lands and different cultures. They didn't force the peoples to completely adopt Greek culture and Greek language. They allowed them to still celebrate their own cultures and religions. But when it came to Antiochus IV, he tried to force the people under his rules to give up their own religions and follow the pagan Greek culture. and become completely adopted into the Grecian way of thinking and the Grecian culture. And this was a diversion from his predecessors. And this particularly came to a very cruel head in the what we saw here as the precious land, or the great land described in Daniel. But it was Palestine. It was the God's promised land to his people. And so the Jewish people had by this point, I know we're skipping a lot of history, but the Jewish people by this point had been returned to their promised land under King Cyrus, and they had been reestablishing the culture and the people. Well, by this time of Antiochus IV's rule, they were back in full swing of their culture and their worship of God. But under Antiochus IV, he was trying to force them to give up worship of God and worship the pagan gods of Greece, and to completely adopt Grecian culture. Well, that worked to an extent. There grew up two groups of the Jewish people then. There were the ones that fully gave themselves over to the Grecian way. They were called the Hellenists. And then there was a group that were holding on to the ways of God and worship in the temple. They were called the Traditionalists. You had these two groups. And it was becoming obvious that these two groups were headed toward a civil war. And so Antiochus steps in with power and might. And he begins strongly persecuting the traditionalist Jews, that they would give up their worship of God. And by the time of the end of Antiochus, he would have murdered, estimates say around 100,000 Jewish people, because of trying to stamp out their worship of God and get them to worship the pagan gods of Greece and follow the Grecian way of living. Now, the mention was in Daniel 8 that this king would be made great in his own mind. He would be obsessed with his own power and greatness. And Antiochus IV adopted a name for himself. In fact, if you look up Antiochus IV, they're going to put another name after that. It's Antiochus Epiphanes. Have you ever heard of an epiphany? It is God making himself manifest. That is what that word in Greek means. God manifest. So Antiochus just said that he adopted this name for himself. I am Antiochus, God manifest. And so that's his. That shows his pride and his obsession with his own greatness. Now the Jews, because of his persecution, gave him a nickname playing off of Antiochus Epiphanes. They called him Antiochus Epimanes. Epimanes. Another Greek word that means the mad one. And so, here, I know that we haven't had time to greatly go into detail all of Antiochus' persecution of the Jews. He led his persecution is what led to the Maccabean revolts. You've probably heard about the time period between the end of the Old Testament and the start of the New Testament. And in that time period, there were Maccabean revolts. And a great deal of those were revolting against Antiochus and his rule. Now why? So this is, a lot of people see Antiochus and his persecution of the Jews as at least a great portion of fulfillment of Daniel 8. Now, why might God have done that? Why might God, in this case, have let his path of redemptive purpose lead through this suffering? Well, there are a couple of ways that we can see, at least looking back, see how God was at work. One thing is, by letting the Grecian Empire take control over such a big portion of the world, God was preparing for the dissemination, the spreading of the message of Jesus Christ. If Jesus had come to the nation of Israel or the nation of Judah before the Grecian Empire had taken over, the word would not have spread so quickly and easily. But you see, because the Grecian Empire had ruled and had spread so wide, there was a common language. Now, everybody was allowed to keep their, at least for the most part, allowed to keep their culture and their languages, except they were supposed to adopt the Greek language for the greater interaction with the empire. So, the common language in the first century, you might be thinking, well, maybe it was Latin because of the Roman Empire, but it wasn't. The common language of the first century when Jesus came and the start of the church was Greek. Koine Greek specifically is common Greek. And so it was the preparation for the spread of the message of Jesus Christ. That's just one hint, one sliver of why God might have allowed these things to happen. But also, by allowing his people to suffer, he was pointing to the fact that the same reason when we suffer, pointing to the fact that this world is not our home, that God has bigger things in store for us, and that we don't live for our own purposes. And that's where we get to the next application. You see, we need to ask ourselves this question. For whose pleasure do I live? For whose pleasure do I live? Am I living for myself, or am I living for something greater? You see, I think from looking at this path of suffering that God's people had to walk, I think we see this idea that we live and we die and we live again for God's pleasure and His eternal glory. You see, if it's all about me, I'm going to choose a path that has no suffering. I'm going to choose a path of ease and comfort. But if it's for God's pleasure, for God's glory, I will walk whatever path is required. Now you might say, this doesn't sound like what I want following Christ to be like. But it's exactly what Christ calls us to. When Jesus is giving a call to His first disciples, He uses these words, take up your cross and follow me. From Matthew 16. He's expanding that out. He says, if anyone would come after me, if you want to be a Christ follower, what are we going to do? It's not choose the path of most comfort, most security, of least resistance. No, he says, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. When I said we live and we die and we live again for God's pleasure and for God's eternal glory, we are invited to live for God and to die for God and one day to live again for God's pleasure. And that's all throughout the New Testament. Paul spoke about this. It's recorded in Acts 14 that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. We also see in Romans this desire for our spiritual good and for God's glory we walk that path of suffering. Romans 5, 3, 4, and 5 talk about that we rejoice in our sufferings. But why do we rejoice? We rejoice because suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts. 1 Peter 2:21, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. You see, just as Daniel saw the suffering his people were going to have to go through, he didn't despair in it. It was overwhelming, but he didn't despair in it. Because he lived for God's pleasure and God's glory. And so I think to wrap all this up, we need to be like Daniel. Because just as he saw that suffering and he was overwhelmed for a time, but then it says in verse 27, then I rose and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision and I did not understand. So even though Daniel was getting a glimpse of the future, he did not let it distract him or discourage him from his task. So we must be the same. Glimpses of the future, whether it's a future of suffering or a future of victory, glimpses of the future should motivate us, not distract us or discourage us. Now I want to think about Daniel's perspective there for just a minute. That he was hearing a message that he did not want to hear. It was fine to hear messages about kingdoms rising and falling that were other kingdoms. But now this was a message about the people of God suffering. It's a message that we don't want to hear either. And God was giving Daniel a glimpse of the future that was, from Daniel's perspective, obscured, but from God's perspective, very clear. That's why it seems so clear now, since these things have come to pass. And Daniel was seeing a mystery that was revealed only in God's perfect timing. There are parts of this that have yet to be fulfilled. See, when Jesus spoke about the book of Daniel, Jesus spoke as if there were things that were in Daniel that were yet to come about. So we get this reality that we live in an already not yet reality. There are ways that God has brought about the fulfillment of his prophecy and ways that those have yet to be fulfilled. Now, Daniel heard one of the heavenly beings ask the question, how long? Specifically, it was how long from the time that the transgression takes place and that the giving over of the sanctuary to be trampled underfoot. And the answer was given for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. There's been a lot of investment in, as I mentioned last week, this time frame, other time frames given in Daniel, other time frames given in Revelation about how to specifically see the times. You know what? God is the only one that knows specifically. There might be hints there that are helpful. But the reason I want us to be careful to not be distracted or discouraged is because there are people that have gone before us that genuinely loved God, genuinely gave their heart over to studying the Bible, and got distracted or discouraged by prophecies. And one example is this man you see here, William Miller. Now, if you are unfamiliar, William Miller was a Baptist pastor in the early and mid-1800s. Now, he was self-taught. He didn't start out as a pastor. In fact, he started out as having lots of different jobs, including serving towns as sheriff and constable and justice of the peace. And he studied and he got great knowledge. And then he turned his study to the Bible and studied the Bible and studied. And he became engrossed in studying prophecy. And he studied specifically Daniel. And specifically Daniel chapter 8. And specifically this verse about 2,300 evenings and mornings. And he said that means years. He was using this interpretation method where you take bits from one part of the Bible and it unlocks a part from the other part of the Bible. And so he said that must mean 2,300 years. And so he looked back in history of Israel and figured out a starting point and calculated 2,300 years from that point. And he said, believe it or not, it is sometime in the next few years that Jesus is coming back. And so William Miller began writing articles and pamphlets and booklets. He began to be invited to speak in churches, and it's a long history over several years where he began to tell people with great passion and great biblical learning and knowledge that he was very convinced that Jesus Christ was returning his second coming in the next few years, that his return was imminent. And so many people got convinced, and more people got on board. They began to narrow the time down, and William Miller said it's between March 31st of 1843 and March 31st of 1844 that God's going to come back. And then somebody else came on board and helped refine this down, and they finally pinpointed a day. They say, you know what, we think we figured it out. It's actually going to be October 22nd, 1844, when Jesus Christ is coming back. And so, what did people do? Well, they became distracted. They became just so distracted. They were so focused. They became so convinced that Jesus was coming back on that day. Think about what you would do if you were convinced without a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was going to come back on a certain day. They probably did what you would do. If you longed for the return of Christ, if you were fully convinced he was coming on a certain day, they stopped working. They stopped reaping their harvest from their fields. This was harvest time. They left their crops in the field. The shop owners just opened the doors and let people come in and take the goods of the shop. They didn't charge them money. People that had money, that even threw their money out. They don't need money. One wealthy man owned a big mill and was very wealthy, and he was going to just sell it to anybody for almost next to nothing. So one of his sons convinced him to sell it to him, and so his son could keep it in the family. And for next to nothing, just giving away businesses. And then they gathered and they were doing everything they could to convince people, turn to Jesus while there's time. And they were very zealous and evangelical and reaching out to people. They were writing and printing letters and articles as fast as they could. They were running the presses 24 hours a day to send out the message, Jesus is coming back. The problem is they put Jesus is coming back on October 22nd, 1844. And then as that final day was approaching, the day before, many of them gathered in churches. Some of them gathered out on this hillside. They sang worship songs, and they waited for the dawn to come when Jesus was going to come back. And he didn't come back. Now, there were dominoes that fell after that. They call it the Great Disappointment. Many people left the faith over it. Believe it or not, there are denominations that started because of this. Seventh-day Adventism came from this. Ellen G. White was a Millerite. Jehovah's Witnesses has roots in Millerism. But where did they go wrong? They didn't go wrong in their zeal and passion for Jesus Christ. They got distracted and discouraged by trying to figure out what these glimpses of the future mean specifically. Instead of letting God's purposes motivate us and keep us faithful and working hard and trusting God to work out the timing, they wanted to work out the timing. And it had disastrous effects. So I heard this very insightful command or instruction from a pastor. Pastor David Guzik said this, and this is how we're going to end. You get ready for Jesus' second coming by trusting in Jesus' first coming. It's as simple as that. We don't have to figure out all these dates. What we do have to figure out is, do I trust God? And am I trusting in Jesus Christ who died for my sins? Am I following him? That's how we get ready. And whether God's timing means that in the next few seconds or days or hours he sends Christ back, or whether it means generations and generations from now he sends Christ back, we can be ready now by trusting in Jesus' first coming. And we're just about to enter into the season of the year where we give extra special attention to Jesus' first coming. But that's where our trust has to be. And so now we're going to, after I pray, we're going to remember Jesus' first coming and his death on the cross by celebrating the Lord's Supper. And I want you to make sure that you are trusting in Jesus' first coming. That kind of trust that can let God be in charge of the future. You just follow him. Whether it leads through suffering, and it likely will, we follow God because we trust in him and in our Savior. Will you pray with me? Our Heavenly Father, thank you that you are in control. God, we do ask you to protect us. As we've seen examples before us of people that they get distracted or discouraged by too great an emphasis on understanding prophecy. Help us to see you clearly at work, clearly directing the future, and in specific detail. But Lord, help us to leave that in your hands, trusting you, being faithful to you. And Lord, even as you might lead us through suffering, as many of our brothers and sisters around the world are walking through suffering, even as those Jewish people suffered under the hands of Antiochus, and especially as Jesus suffered on the cross innocently for our sins. Help us to be faithful as well. And so, Lord, I pray for those in the room who have yet to put faith in Christ, that today will be the day that they are ready for Christ's second coming because they put faith in him and the work he did at his first coming. Make us all stand in that faith and in that trust. Even now as we celebrate Jesus' body broken, his blood shed to make us your children by washing us clean of the sins that we earned and giving us instead a righteousness that we did not earn. And we celebrate that. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to invite the elders.